Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to A Moral Action. I am your host, Jeffrey Joseph, your friendly neighborhood youth minister. And joining me today is Mike, the not yet infamous Untie. Welcome to the pod.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Would you like to give some of the audience a little bit of background on, not necessarily about you personally, or you could if you'd like, but also a little bit about where your trains of thought come from and things like that?
My trains of thought. Well, I've been told I have an odd way of thinking, but I think that's not necessarily a bad thing, right?
Sure.
I come from the South, kind of Bible Belt area,
Hmm.
but I was educated in the North, in New York and Boston, and I teach kind of in the Midwest, and so I think um my perspective is something that's been shared in different areas and influenced by different areas, and so now what I teach actually is ecumenism and interreligious dialogue. And for your audience, if they may not know, ecumenism or ecumenical dialogue refers to dialogue between different Christian denominations, whether it's Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons or Roman Catholics, Anglicans, whatever it is.
Excellent. And I know from personally knowing you, of course, I know that you have a bit of more of a distinctly philosopher's take on things,
Yes.
and the way that you're very precise with language and things like that. So I think that'll play an important role in the conversation we'll start. And we might as well start with one of the biggest stories that we've had in the last couple of weeks, which really ties into something that we've had going on for the last few years, and that, of course, is the Baltimore riots. So mostly the riots and the protests and things like that have died down. But did you have any general thoughts about the way that the Baltimore riots occurred, about the way that they were portrayed in the media, about any sort of systemic injustice they may point to, or
Sure.
somebody coming out and immediately pointing the finger at those hoodlums, and in fact President Obama referring to them as thugs and things like that?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of politics involved there, right? I think Obama is having to dance that line that he always has between uh, being someone who is from the black community and able to talk to the black community at the same time having to dialogue with increasingly uh, tense uh, non-minority communities. And finding out how to play that role, I think, can be extremely difficult, especially when you have one community that feels disenfranchised and is looking to Obama to represent them in a way that really makes change. So I can see the frustration there from both sides. I think, though, the most disturbing thing that came out of this was that I believe that there was a potential, if not, it actually might have happened, a suspension of habeas corpus uh, in Baltimore
Hmm.
because the redefinition of the rioters as not as rioters but as rebels. And I think that's going to be one of the most interesting things to come out of this, at least constitutionally. Uh, and I hesitate to use the word Orwellian because that can be kind of inflaming language,
Right.
but redefining citizens who are rioting because they are disenfranchised. They are rioting because they feel like they're being oppressed by the state. Redefining them as rebels so that you can suspend their constitutional rights is a very slippery slope that is somewhat Orwellian in nature. And I think that is something that we need to reevaluate. Only a few times in history that I can think of has habeas corpus been suspended during a time of real rioting. I mean, Abraham Lincoln, though, was one of those individuals who famously did it. But that
Hmm.
was for a much bigger reason, actual secession. So if, all the things that go into the riots in Baltimore, the response from the state has been the most disturbing to me. Not just the riots themselves, which happen every couple of years for good reason.
Right, absolutely. But I think even the response by the state has been at least somewhat nuanced because, as it turns out, the district attorney is proceeding with an indictment against those officers who were involved in the Freddie Gray incident, which is what, of course, sparked all these riots most immediately. Of course, to say that that's what sparked the riots and just leave it there is, of course, misrepresenting the situation. There really is systemic injustice and things like that. But nonetheless, there is someone who took a stand, and that was a young district attorney who decided that she wanted to be able to proceed, despite the fact that, of course, that makes her job moving forward much more difficult because they're in a curious position where they have to work with the police to be able to enforce the law, but who's going to enforce, or who's going to watch the watchman, as they say in both the movie and, of course, famously quoted anyway.
Sure, and one of the dangers is there's a lot of pressure then put on this case. It must go through. If this district attorney fails to prosecute properly, it might only exacerbate the problem and might cause other DAs in the future not to even go after police officers who have clearly done something wrong for fear that they might not get the indictment they seek. It is politics, right? And I think
Mm-hmm.
there are some issues with this case regarding whether or not the individual had a knife, what type of knife, whether it's a violation of not just state or federal laws, but actually local Baltimore laws regarding like a spring knife or something like that.
Sure.
And so the minutia of the laws might actually get in the way of real justice happening here, and that's just the unfortunate reality of the situation. So I think that the DA might have stepped into something that might backfire and really prevent us from addressing the real problem, which is a systematic kind of restructuring of how police officers interact with the black community, but also the poor community or the lower income community, and how we might better train officers so that we can support them in a way so these kinds of things don't happen in the first place. How do we become proactive, not just react?
Sure. And I think from a public perception perspective also, of course, it is with a lot of things, it has become a very polarizing issue. And it seems like everyone has to be either totally opposed to police officers or totally in support, blindly in support. And public discussion isn't often allowed for nuance, or it doesn't allow for nuance. And that's a real problem. Uh, I think, and it's something that I've talked about multiple times about the shorter attention spans, of course, and just looking for the headline, just looking for clickbait type things. And so you have a very incendiary headline, and then people will go around talking about it around the water cooler, as it were, without actually having even read the article or trying to find out what the details of the case might have been. And that is problematic with this, and also problematic pointing back to uh, Ferguson and with the Eric Garner case and things like that, where they did not proceed with a prosecution, and probably because it was so complicated with this, because they do have to work with them, but also because if they failed and it was already under the national spotlight, then why would anybody in the future choose to proceed with these sorts of things? And
Right.
even I think it was in Ferguson, and I should check to be sure, but I believe the prosecutor had brought up or raised laws that were actually outdated by the 1980s and things like that, in terms of uh, what rights the officer has and things like that. And so, and that may have been just a simple, genuine mistake, but that's exacerbated by the fact that what a person that probably had no right to be in such a high-profile case is suddenly brought to the fore because it's become a national case.
Right. And that kind of danger we're seeing in all sorts of cities, whether it's Cleveland or Chicago. Although Chicago does have some development, as we'll probably talk about. But is prosecution really ultimately going to be the solution? No. And more than that, a lot of communities that did rioted not really because of the particular incident, because we did see in Ferguson maybe that the particular incident required more nuance and understanding and recognizing that maybe charges should not have been filed in all instances. But that does not mean that there isn't a systematic abuse against minority or lower income people, and that's really what the riots were about. So should we address the issue with prosecutions? Well, when it's appropriate, sure. But the best justice we can really bring to these individuals, especially these kids who've been killed, is to change the way that we police. And I think in Cleveland, with the example of that 12-year-old boy who was shot,
Sure.
uh, and he was shot within 2 seconds of the police officer getting out of the car. We can talk about prosecuting the police officer and all that until we're blue in the face, but that doesn't change how the police address issues like that. A kid who was reported to have had a toy gun, or reported by a witness to probably having a toy gun. The dispatch may or may not have told that to the police officer who arrived on scene, who immediately shot this kid.
Hmm.
And I suspect also all these individuals involved who witnessed seem to think that this individual was older than he actually was. Even when the police officer went up to the 12-year-old who was dead and he radioed it in and he could see the kid, he still
Mhm.
thought he was 20. And that might show a lack of, frankly, just white people being around black people,
Sure.
knowing what age they are. So some real sensitivity training, but also actual coming together and having black friends, as cliche as that sounds. Knowing black people might cause you to not shoot other black people immediately, as silly as that sounds.
Right. And that seems like simple enough to say, of course, and rather difficult to actually execute it. And you and I have talked
Sure.
about this before about how Chicago, one of the four largest cities, or I think the third largest city in the United States, is also considered the most segregated place in the, if not the U.S., possibly the entire world. And so while there are obviously people around of different ethnicities, the natural inclination is always going to be to huddle up with the people that you know, the people that look like you. And that's just as true for minorities as it would be for a white population. So it's, again, easier said than done. But you've talked about getting to know them. What do you think about the possible institution of body cameras? That's been a popular sentiment, is that maybe every officer needs to be wearing a body camera. Do you think that would really inhibit these sorts of actions, or do you think it would make little to no difference?
Well, there are quite a few factors. Part of the problem is that we do know in one case where a man was still choked to death, even though there was a body camera videotaping it. And that's been an ongoing complaint against body cameras, or at least maybe just a voicing of frustration. Like, well, there was a body camera, so why wasn't anything different done here? Again, that goes to proper training. So body cameras we have to enforce if we're going to have them, but we also have to have proper training. But my primary concern, in addition to that, would be also the cost involved with body cameras. And a lot of people haven't talked about this as much. Um, we've found more and more that cameras that are meant to catch drivers, at those red light
Sure.
cameras, whatever they're called, they're actually kind of financial scams. People kind of rent out those cameras to the state, and the state pays all this money, and then the state has to fine people for being caught with those cameras in order to pay for them. It's a big scam, and it's a waste of money. Body cameras have the same problem. We rent or kind of buy or lease these cameras from these companies. We then have to stream all that information to servers, which can cost tens of thousands of dollars per month just to maintain all of that data. Much of the time, we can't know whether or not that will be used for prosecution. And even if it is, you have to have someone who processes all that video as evidence. So we have to make sure if we're going to invest all that money, we're actually going to use the resource properly. And I'm not convinced yet that we're going to because of
Sure.
that choking case.
Just to clarify, are you speaking about the Eric Garner case, or are you talking about a different case?
I
Because the
think,
Eric Garner
at
case,
this point, you have so much. I think it is the Eric Gardner with the selling cigarettes on the street.
right? And I think that actually was a
Oh, was
camera
it?
that
Oh,
had
okay.
recorded it,
Hmm.
but it was somebody who was independent of the actual scene. But what that pointed to was that even when there are cameras by outsiders, there has been an undercurrent of police officers getting angry at people who bother to record
Right.
police action. And given the antipathy toward outsiders bothering to use these cameras, what value does it present to actually have the officers themselves have the cameras? And as you suggested with the Eric Garner case, when something transparently illegal happens, nothing not remotely ambiguous, something very much illegal, contrary to the law happened, there was no proceeding forward from that and in any way indicting the officer, certainly not in any public way. Perhaps there was a more private conversation had with the officer, but nonetheless, Eric Garner is dead.
Right.
There's no
No
resolve
real
for him.
justice for him. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
And what's to prevent an officer from, let's say they had their body camera on their chest, what's to prevent them from, accidentally covering it up every once in a while or it dropping off? All these excuses that come up because we're creating new laws for police officers. That's sort of like a bandage on a wound that needs to be more directly addressed. And again, training is the best
Sure.
way to address that. I think that England has a system that is very monitored by cameras.
Hmm.
and maybe understanding better how they succeeded or failed in different areas with those, because they have CCTV all over the country, well, at least in their cities. How we might benefit from those systems in an intelligent way, approaching this in an intelligent way, not just blindly throwing money at a situation and expecting it to change, because it won't.
Right. And what I think is interesting about that is that Chicago very much has a vast network of cameras all throughout, not just for trying to catch people, running red lights, because that has been a thing here, but also just generally. There are many a blue box on the corner of a street that clearly has a camera, but that has not, it would appear, has not curtailed the violence, certainly, that has occurred in the city, to the point where even hip hop stars are referencing Chicago as Chirac, as if it were a war zone. And so, it's become a popular sentiment that there's so much violence perpetuated here in the city, and the cameras seem to have done very little, if not nothing. So I don't know how better that would be implemented, but there are so many ways that could go wrong, right? The camera itself could be covered, as you suggested. The feed might be cut off accidentally or otherwise, and it could be
Right.
purely
It could be
accidental,
accident, sure, sure.
and it could be less than accidental. Uh, and besides that, who's going to process it? If the DA has to have a relationship with the officers moving forward, and of course, officers, as they would and probably should, would try to at least mount some sort of defense of the officer, because they are a fraternity of people in the same profession who are, in theory, all trying to do well, and they're trying to serve and protect. So they have to mount their defense. And that just complicates relationships moving forward, because then actual criminals may not be caught for doing very nefarious criminal things. Um, so I think that the body cameras are interesting, but I also think another complication with this issue is I don't think that, on the whole, people in general really care about what what that sort of evidence would produce. For example, and this is something I talked about before, when Edward Snowden dumped all those files, how many people even recognize who Edward Snowden is? Now, he is essentially an enemy of the state at this point. He's stuck in Russia, and he can't even come home because the state absolutely wants him to be in prison permanently and locked away forever, and all that, because he's such a terrible
Another
person.
example of the state suspending human rights in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Absolutely, and it is exactly that. And it's suspending human rights because somebody bothered to speak out against the state already suspending human rights in different ways, just superseding whatever laws that existed for every normal person and every reasonable expectation we would have as a public to go ahead and uh, process information that they should not have had access to in the first place. And now, just a couple of years later, people don't even know who Edward Snowden is. But for the most part, the impression seems to be that he's just some traitor or whatever. He's off where he should be, because that's essentially what the story has been as pitched to the media by the state. So would body cameras really have an effect if people on the whole don't want to have to worry about that?
Yeah, and to an extent, I mean, I think you speak to the background noise that is the media. Sometimes you have enough, if you have enough stories, then people become sort of calloused to even the issue. So at some point, we'll have so many body camera images of police violating, this, that, or the other, just because there are thousands and thousands of police, not because police are inherently susceptible, obviously.
Right.
And so even if you did have body cameras and the media did report it properly, would that mean that things would change? No, no, I don't think so. Ultimately, we have to institutionalize a just system, because people can't be trusted always to maintain that system. They just simply get exhausted from story after story after story. And in regards to Snowden, yeah, I think the media has passed on. He was a big story, and then it's done. That's our attention span. That's the media's attention span. And sure, the government was telling the media what to think in some cases, but I think there was, as someone who's on Reddit, I think I found a few examples of newspapers trying to do better,
Sure.
recognizing that they were failing. So I still have hope. I just think that hope needs to be institutionalized for it to actually change anything. I can't just rely on the random person to do what's right.
Sure. And this actually points to another thing that I wanted to talk to you about, which was that, of course, it's easy for us outsiders to criticize the media because of the way that they portray, for example, of course, the Baltimore riots as stemming from the Freddie Gray. I think at least we can agree that the state seems to agree it was a murder. So the death, at least, of Freddie Gray, but potentially murder of Freddie Gray. And of course, that's going to be portrayed in such a way that the people who are rioting look like the villain because this is one incendiary act and it can be caught on camera and it's a whole host of people acting. So we can criticize the media to say, hey, why don't you show all of the systemic injustice that has been going on or reference this systemic injustice that's been going on, the millions and millions of dollars that the Baltimore state has had to pay, by state, of course, I mean the government has had to pay out because of terrible actions from its police force and things like that, which is what made them uncomfortable in the first place.
Sure.
But how realistically would you broadcast that as a media outlet, as a whether it be TV or newspaper? How would they improve the way that they would go about that in presenting that so that they could actually have a nuanced perspective, be able to talk about something that was more than just the incendiary picture or pointing the finger and again, like I said, Barack Obama referencing the thugs, which, as a number of people have suggested over the last couple of years, is really just another way of using the N-word
Mm-hmm.
coming from the president that only exacerbates the issue.
Mm-hmm.
But do you have
Yeah,
any?
NPR actually had a great kind of coverage of that word thug, and I think there are a few people who've studied its usage in the more postmodern period. Obviously, thug's been around for a long time, but as an evolving word, what does it refer to? And it does seem to be synonymous, at least in some circles, with um, calling someone the N-word. And so I think that is really problematic. Does that mean Obama was necessarily using it that way? I don't think so. But I think, all right, what you speak to is the media's presentation of nuance. And I'm not sure how much we can ever expect the media to do what is really the role of teachers and families. And I think that's one unreasonable expectation we'll never get over. My job as a teacher is to teach students to not look at categories. And I'll give you an example. So this is my philosopher's session, right? So I teach my students that chairs don't exist. And that's actually one of my first lessons. I say, all right, your extra credit assignment is if at the end of the year you can prove to me that chairs exist, you'll get extra credit. And of course, they're saying, well, of course chairs exist. No, chairs do not exist. Objects which we call chairs exist. It's a category, right? So for those of you who might be saying, what? Think of everything in our world. They are all made of matter. They are all objects of some kind extended into space. We apply terms to them so that we can navigate our reality. But whether I call a door or a gobbledygook doesn't matter. Gobbledygooks exist as much as doors. Right, so starting there, I think we can move to looking at categories like government, or rioters, or black people, or white people. The problem with these categories is that they are much more complicated than chair and door. What they end up doing is they make individuals into categories, right? Steve is rioting and beating up a person on the street, but that does not mean that all the rioters are. And even if all the rioters are doing something wrong, it doesn't mean they're doing things that are wrong to the same degree, or that they all agree with what's happening to the same degree, right? It's actually really nuanced, and you need to take each individual from their unique perspective. Is it the media's job to do that? I don't think it's possible for them to do it. But every time a kid or an adult looks at the media and sees individuals doing things, their job is to be critical. And I think we need to put some of the blame back onto the consumer and saying, why aren't you being a critical observer of the news? Why aren't you getting rid of those categories? Like, look at all those black people rioting. I think we're not doing that enough. And I'll give you an example. There was a controversial principal in Alabama, I think this week, who got into trouble because she was giving what was already reportedly an offensive speech to graduation or something like that. And she asked people to not leave, because people were starting to get up and leave. And she said, "Oh, look, of course, it's all the black people leaving." When she saw people who happened to be black who were leaving, all she saw was the category of
Hmm.
black people. She didn't see people leaving. Now that's a social construct, right? That's ontologically uh, subjective, but epistemologically objective, the racial construction, right? So all she saw was the social construct instead of seeing people who were leaving because they were offended, right? So when we look at the news, are we looking at the news critically so that we do not see categories, or are we seeing the news just as our society has taught us to? That is my fault if I'm doing that, not the media's necessarily.
Sure, and absolutely, I think that certainly the onus does come back to us ultimately, right? Because whatever the media puts out there, we have to analyze it. We have to be able to bother to look at it critically enough and do our own research and things like that.
Sure.
But I think also that's while I think it is true that we should be more critical as consumers, I think the media has created a way, certainly in the last 20 years, I would argue, in the U.S., has created a way for us to be less reliant on ourselves and more reliant on a story that they have developed, which happens to
Mm-hmm.
cater to one particular pole or the other. And of course, I'm going to point to Fox News, which really started this, and you know, as an economic enterprise, absolutely worked to perfection. They did exactly what they needed to do and should have done to be able to capitalize, as in work in a capitalistic system, to provide a very particular perspective that works very effectively to cater to a very particular audience, and it very deliberately references itself as fair and balanced when it is very also deliberately, even if it's only in the subtext, obviously not fair and or balanced because they have no such intention. Because as an enterprise, as an economic enterprise, it doesn't benefit them to be
Sure.
nuanced.
Economic benefits, yeah. But then, okay, so let's look at this anthropologically, and then from this critique of categories. So we can't have, well, perhaps we could, but I don't see the reasonable kind of moral outrage that we could have against Fox News for simply expressing what its culture is already demanding it to become, right? The culture, let's say right wing kind of especially Christian kind of culture, desires a sort of perspective, and it is reinforcing its categories, reinforcing its culture through a media conglomerate, right? Well, I don't see that that is necessarily immoral. It's simply not objective, and if it's not objective, then the best thing that I can do is turn it off and tell people, look, that is a cultural lens, right? If we talk about hermeneutics all the time. This is just a cultural lens. It's not that it's distorted any more than any other lens. Uh, it's that it's not objective, and so it leads to invalid arguments, right? And it's as simple as that. And so, if people want to live by invalid arguments, then it's not that you don't respect their opinion, but you can say of their opinion it's not valid, and leave it at that. And so, I never watch Fox News. I really dislike MSNBC. I do not watch it. I watched C-SPAN the other day. It's not as boring as people say it is. It's really not. People always said about Bill Clinton that he was boring as a person, and they put aside like the jazz and all that. When you talk to Bill Clinton, it was all about policy, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not about political opinion. And people can. I know people really hate the Clintons and all that, or really love them. It's one or the other, it seems. But if you look at what's best about politicians when they're at their best, it's when they are not just objective, but they're all about policy, right? And it's that kind of objectivity that's nice. But sort of the moral outrage, I don't think I understand anymore because it all goes back to categories. I see individuals within the conservative another category movement who are simply expressing who they are. Anthropologically, that's what it is.
Are they actually expressing who they are? And the reason why, of course, I bring this up is certain examples like an Ann Coulter, who
Mm-hmm.
is absolutely playing a character. Not unlike how Stephen Colbert is playing a character, has been playing a character on the Colbert
Yeah.
Report. But anyone who knows her background, who knows what she's saying, could not possibly be congruous with what she knows intellectually, what her intellectual faculties are. So is she actually representing herself, or is she playing a character and trying not to break character? So basically, is she effectively, to use a wrestling term, is she a heel? Is she playing a heel on TV the same way that in the 80s and 90s we had wrestling characters who would play a heel, play the bad guy, say things that were outrageous and intentionally outrageous, and try not to break character even when they were in real life? Uh, Again, to make a wrestling reference that may or may not make sense to you or certain listeners, but the Iron Sheik 20 years ago was caught with Hacksaw Jim Duggan, and they were supposed to be very much opposed to each other. One was very American, and one was very much Iranian, and they were supposed to be all at arms with each other all the time. And then they got caught drinking, driving down the road together, and so
Yeah.
that shattered the illusion, and that is why the Iron Sheik could not really work again. It was because he bothered to embark on this thing that got them into a situation where he shattered the illusion of wrestling as it was.
Mhm.
And Ann Coulter, as a character, she makes money as this character, so it is in her best interest not to break that character. But if you look at her background and look at what she's done in the past, leading up to building this character, somehow you have to know that this is not actually her. This is just what her money making avenue is at this time.
Mhm. Yeah, the political theatrics. No, granted, I think there's great validity to that, and it kind of reminds me of some of these ISIS leaders. I think it was an ISIS leader who there are pictures of him on the internet with like cards stuck to his head while he's drinking. He's playing a drinking game, and of course that's not okay for ISIS members to do, and he wants it taken off the internet, and that's not going to happen.
Hmm.
So it makes us ask the question: does he actually believe in what he says, or is it a money-making scheme? And I've maintained that it's sort of like Mexican cartels. They use Catholicism to cover their crimes, or the mafia they used family or the Catholic Church to cover some of their crimes. ISIS is quite often using religion to cover their sex slave trade, their drug trade, and their power struggle to get resources and land. They're just using religion as a cover. Perhaps Ann Coulter is using our American culture to simply grab money. But people probably said the same about Glenn Beck. And I don't know if you remember, Glenn Beck had his interesting show where he started wearing glasses and all that, right?
Of course.
Um, and there was a moment where he had to go to the hospital for some. I thought it was like colon surgery or something. It was something pretty dire, right? And he had railed against the healthcare system, or not against it, said it was the best in the world, and that
Hmm.
everyone's wrong to attack our healthcare system until he went there, right? Once he experienced it, 180-degree turn, right? He was open to growth, to use a Jesuit term, right?
Hmm.
This understanding that he could actually be wrong about this. Does Ann Coulter possess that? Perhaps not, and if not, then that's a problem. But I do think there are individuals in the conservative movement who are more than willing to change their perspective, and I think Glenn Beck, oddly, maybe some people would say, would represent one of those individuals. I think Jon Stewart on the left is one of those people, and Colbert especially,
Hmm.
are individuals who are open to growth when they see that they're like a good scientist almost. When they see that their worldview and facts do not match, they change their worldview, not the facts. Although Glenn Beck may not always be rational in all of his theories, that direct experience changed him. And I think that should give us at least the opportunity, again, not to see the conservative movement as a category, but remember that there are individuals. And there are some who are just perhaps amoral, like maybe Ann Coulter is. There's a difference.
There is a difference. Although I have to say that I think Glenn Beck is probably the wrong counterexample to offer because Glenn
Possibly.
Beck self-identifies as a clown, and I think this is something I talked about in a previous podcast. When pushed for the fact that much of what he says does not include validity in fact, that it is basically just campaigning as this
Conjecture. Yeah.
ultra, yeah, exactly. It's conjecture based on a theory, based on nothing, basically, based on what he thinks will sell today, more or less. And his response to that was, well, look, I'm a clown. Basically, that's all that I am. So you shouldn't take me any seriously. And the interesting point is that he does in that way try to shape himself as the right's counterpart to Jon Stewart. But Jon Stewart, of course, is actually a comedian. So when pushed on, why don't you push harder on these politicians and things like that, he says, ultimately, I am a comedian. It is my
Hmm.
job to make people laugh. But of course, I think recently he's started to see himself as something more than that. I think that's why he did the movie that he did last year and things like that. But nonetheless, fundamentally, you could say that he obviously is going for a laugh. That is what he is doing. Glenn Beck self-identifies as a clown because he's not because he's going for a laugh, but because that
Hmm.
removes some of the stigma of him having not really grounded his theories and his stories and his books and things like that on facts, but rather on a conjecture that he feels can sell well. Ultimately, is what it comes down to. So when he
Or
criticizes,
simply an inability to admit a fault of foolishness. I think we're all
sure,
susceptible to that, right? It's hard to say, oh, in that particular instance, I was not only wrong, but I was an utter idiot, right? It's sometimes easier to just say I'm a clown in sort of this way that's still a defense. It's a
hmm
defense, but it's not actually admitting real faults. So, in this kind of Jesuit way, how do we presume the good? I have seen evidence that Glenn Beck has a willingness to change perspective, but I do not think that he's a perfect person. I think very easily you can be tempted by the money, right? And that
oh,
he
absolutely,
is he is devious in some ways. He said one of the reasons, in fact, the primary reason he converted to Mormonism. Have you heard why?
because of his wife,
Because specifically he said because he wanted to have sex with his wife.
right?
So
Mm,
he's willing to do big things like convert to Mormonism, which is radically different from Catholicism in
sure,
many ways. Uh, Willing to do that simply for personal gains, right? Whether or not it's sort of an insidious sort of manipulation of millions of people, I don't know. It's hard to say, and I think people are more complicated than what our biases usually like to make us feel is likely true about them. I don't know. I'll say that. What's her name? You said her name. What's her
and
name?
Coulter.
Ann Coulter and Bill O'Reilly are probably on the same level. I would agree to that.
So they're on the same level in terms of what? Just to be clear.
In terms of uh, their inability to admit being wrong, even when faced with clear facts that show that they are wrong. They've demonstrated being hypocritical repeatedly, and I think
Sure.
there are individuals within the conservative movement who have truly changed their perspective. Yeah, I was really disappointed. I remember 15 years ago, John McCain was a really impressive individual,
hmm
and then when he was just soundly defeated by Bush during the primaries, he became this different monster. Before then, he was this amazing individual who was very much a midline kind of individual. Jon Stewart actually really liked him too.
Sure.
You know, there are plenty of conservatives who represent that, but I think you're right that what sells is probably the more inflammatory MSNBC and Coulter, Fox News characters. But we have to be careful not to assign that kind of character to every individual within the conservative movement or even at
Sure.
Fox News.
Absolutely. And I don't in any way intend to try to portray all conservatives
Sure.
under any particular brush or all liberals with a particular brush. I bring up Fox News because they did start it here in the U.S. They started that movement toward less objective or a less attempt to be objective at news.
Mm-hmm.
And then they took it one way that was so successful that, of course, MSNBC tried to do the same thing for the left and actually happened to do it less successfully,
Far
which is
less.
why
Yeah.
Fox News is the more popular of the two channels. You could argue whether or not it's because the populations they're appealing to are less or more likely to listen to that sort of appeal, but that's on them.
Well, it'll
Nonetheless,
be very interesting. Christianity has, in general, fallen in the last 10 years. Did you see this latest report?
the
I think it's
Pew,
the
yeah,
Pew report on
hmm
Christianity, pretty dramatically falling. I think it's like 6% in the last 10 years.
sure.
3% from Catholics, 3% from Protestants. Islam is up.
hmm
And so as demographics are changing, we'll see what happens to Fox News. It'll be very interesting.
What I thought, and I know this a little bit because I spent months basically critically analyzing Fox News, was that for all of the anti-Muslim tirades that some of their most popular hosts may have gone on, one of the largest percentage owners was a Saudi prince who
Yeah.
absolutely just threw some money in there because he knew that he was going to make money, and it didn't matter to him what they said on a day-to-day basis, and it didn't obviously his partial ownership didn't matter to any of the hosts, which to a degree sort of suggests that there may be some level of a lack of authenticity in what they're saying. Because if they really believed it, how could they believe that knowing that one of the people that they answer to is a Saudi prince of all people, one of the types of people that they railed against all the time?
Mhm.
But nonetheless, again, it's an economic enterprise. Maybe it didn't matter to them. Rupert Murdoch was still the majority owner, and he still represented the majority of who they would be answering to anyway. But why would this Saudi prince even be interested in that, other than as an economic enterprise? It obviously had lasting power. Even when Glenn Beck basically got kicked off the air because people were reporting the very many heinous things that he would say on air to his sponsors to the point where they felt like they had to retract their sponsorship. Didn't bother the Saudi prince at all. Well, whatever. I still like my stake in that company, and that's the way it's going to be.
Yeah, I mean, and I suppose that's a human condition. I mean, I'm speaking to you on an iPad right now. Now, I didn't purchase it, yeah, but nonetheless, it was given to me by a friend. But nonetheless, I'm using a product that was no doubt made unethically
Sure.
by your and my ethical standards, right?
Hmm.
I can tell by I know those bookshelves behind you. I can't imagine that they're made with the best kind of ecological concerns in mind, right?
Can't imagine they were.
So monetary or economic principles sometimes aren't always upheld. And I have a friend actually. He wants to buy vegan and eco-friendly shoes that are dress shoes, and we can't find a single one. Not a single one that looks like an appropriate dress shoe. That means there's nobody who's really interested in a vegan, also, economically and ecologically ethical shoe. That means there are so many people who say, they really care about the environment and ethics and all that, but they don't actually live by it. So why should we hold the Saudi prince to a standard that is higher than our own? I don't know that we can. Or anyone at Fox News, especially those
Right.
reporters who could be fired. I mean, they care about their careers,
Hmm.
right? If their boss is a Saudi prince, even Al Gore, when he sold his TV station, he sold it to someone who was the heir of an oil company, I think, in the Middle East.
Hmm.
So, I mean, money wins ultimately for all of us.
Yeah, sadly but true.
Yeah.
Uh,
So to transition, looking at that coffee case,
hmm.
I think we've mentioned before. So for viewers, they might not know, there's kind of a history of people being burned by coffee, and
Hmm.
people often can be burned by coffee and then sue for millions of dollars. And I think when it happened with McDonald's, a lot of people made fun of this individual and said, "Oh, how can you sue McDonald's for $1 million if you've burned yourself?" I think most people, if they were in this situation, would have done the exact same thing. But we like to say that we wouldn't. We'd like to say that the Saudi prince shouldn't be investing in Fox News, or that we would act differently if we worked for Fox News. I'm not sure that we actually would.
Right. And to elaborate on the specific case that you're talking about, because I have presented it yet to the listeners and viewers, there was a particular case of a police officer, and if I'm not mistaken, is a police officer in Raleigh, North Carolina, who happened to have sued Starbucks after he spilled coffee that he had acquired for free from the Starbucks. He spilled it on himself and then sued that Starbucks for several $100,000. I believe he had intended to sue for $10 million according to his lawyer, but there is a legal limit to how much he was allowed to sue the Starbucks for. So that was the limit that he was suing for.
Hmm.
And his argument was that the argument was that he had Crohn's disease previous to this, of course. But then after this, he lost a lot of functionality in his day-to-day life, and so that was why he was suing the Starbucks. And of course, the headline as presented makes it an absolutely ludicrous case in that it just says cop sues Starbucks for coffee he got for free for millions of dollars or whatever, or for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And of course, again, this is the problem of nuance. You have to actually click on the article to find out anything else about it. But can we really point the finger at that cop and say that we would not have done the same thing, which is what you're arguing, that we would all have probably tried to do the same thing if it was an opportunity for us to acquire some funds to be able to get better, which I think is ultimately what this officer is trying to do. The fact that he is a police officer is only relevant insofar as we're talking, as we have been talking lately, about the Freddie Gray riots in Baltimore and the Eric Garner case and the Ferguson case and all of that. So it doesn't really matter. It's not relevant to any of those other cases at all. But that is part of the reason why it became an article on the front page of
Yeah.
something like a Huffington Post or even a Google News or something like that, is because you immediately can make that association, even if they don't make that association explicit.
Yeah, it's another use of a category for us to confirm
Exactly.
our own bias. That's a real danger, and I think that's something, I certainly need to work on. I think you identified it perfectly. It's only in the news because he's a police officer. See, I don't know the background enough, whether or not Starbucks has been warned about the temperature of their coffee. This case that happened 20 years ago or so at McDonald's, where an old woman was burned severely by coffee, and she sued for $1 million. The media category, of course,
Hmm.
did go after her in what seemed to be a systematic way, or maybe it was just very, very poor news reporting by everyone. But it was not a case of a greedy person, but in fact, McDonald's had been warned repeatedly and told not to have such hot coffee. The woman was sitting in the driver, or not in the driver, in the passenger seat in the parking lot when it popped open and burned her third-degree burns, I think even down to the bone in some cases. I mean, it was horrendous, horrific, and easily avoided by McDonald's following the rules that it was supposed to. Now, whether or not this happens with Starbucks, I don't know, but I think you point out something very good. The maybe not systematic attempt of the media to attack uh, people who sue, but certainly the clickbait issue, and
Hmm.
that's an important term, yeah, and that's an economically driven um, immoral issue. You know, getting people to click things, not necessarily an intention to target people. And there is a difference, So the easy way to change that is not to read newspapers that do that. I think Al Jazeera Network, the BBC, Guardian is okay. Some of these newspapers are much better at not using clickbait. But
Sure.
papers that do use clickbait, being openly against that is the way that we change it. We are the consumer.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. And actually, to bring this to another avenue, uh, because you and I are both gamers, when it comes to video games that are trying to sell us microtransactions, or when they try to give us part of the game or have more of the game on the disc, for example, on a disc-based game, so for like console games especially, but also for PC gaming as well, when part of it is locked and it is only unlocked by paying an extra sum of money, the obvious recourse for us as consumers would be to say, well, then I refuse to absolutely download that DLC, the downloadable content, or to unlock that stuff that you have on the disk, what have you. And the same, of course, is true for media. If we don't click on it, if we refuse to click on it, we send a message, albeit a subtle one, and it takes a group of us to be able to make that a real effective change moving forward. But that is effectively how we vote on whether or not that's a viable tactic, right?
absolutely. I have great examples of it actually working. Now, EA, everyone's working on EA, right?
Sure.
Eventually, they will leave the dark side, ideally, or just be broken up. Who knows? May they burn for all eternity, of course. Uh, but I think there are good examples in the banking world. Uh, Citibank and what is Bank of America lost tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of customers because of their banking practices. And people decided to put their money in local banks, community banks. And that's
Hmm.
a really positive thing that you can do. I decided to do that specifically because of that. And I closed my bank account with Citi and I said, no, you're an ethical company. I cannot support this. And I moved my money. And they have at least acknowledged some of that. Now, regards to gaming, the problem is this with microtransactions and things like iPads and iPhones. There's a term called whale. I don't know if you heard about it. It was in the Wall Street Journal 2 days ago or so. referring
Absolutely.
to people who pay microtransactions of up to $100 per month, an absurd amount. But they make up two-thirds of the gross income of most of these games, right?
Hmm.
Because of microtransactions. So there's no incentive for these gaming companies to move away from that because of compulsive purchases or by compulsive consumers, people who are not going to change their habits because they have a real addiction, right? And these games are designed to be addictive.
Right.
So, you and I might have that sensibility, but there are people who are wasting lots of money who can't afford it. And I'm not sure what you can do except try to educate kids, especially as a teacher, to change the practices.
Yeah, and I think I don't know how the Wall Street Journal or whatever article that presented it brought it up, but of course the term whale refers to the same sort of thing in the gambling world generally.
Oh,
And
that's
that's been a
right. Yeah.
term that's been around for years and years. Is that they'll, especially in Vegas and things like that, they'll have specific people who will go and seek out the millionaires or billionaires who are coming into Las Vegas casinos and wine and dine them and things like that, so that they spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars per trip, because they know that that's viable for them and helps them obviously economically. It will pay that person's salary for the entire year potentially in one trip, and so it is absolutely worth it to that casino to be able to have multiple people like that on staff. And actually, for what it's worth, I think there was a show Las Vegas or Vegas or something like that that used to be on TV that actually dramatized this sort of activity in Vegas. That they're actively seeking out whales as they identified them as on the show and have in Vegas for decades. They seek these out because they can absolutely sustain themselves almost exclusively on them. And whatever they do for the other consumers, that's just icing on the cake. If you happen to get treated well, great. If not, oh well, that's so be
Right.
it.
Who cares?
But as in Vegas and with video games, it does absolutely cater to very much an addictive behavior, which as outsiders we of course can look at and say that's first of all that's unreasonable. They shouldn't fall for that trap. But second of all, how dare you cater to an addictive behavior? That person has a problem. But as an economic enterprise, it's in their economic interest to go after that. They could argue that if not us, then somebody else would do it.
Right.
And part of this starts with the idea of these freemium games, free games, but not really free because in order to play more than the 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever, they ask you to deposit some amount of money, and of course they just kind of chip away until they've got their hundreds of dollars a month or what have you, to the point of Electronic Arts, EA, as you referenced. Their quarterly earnings report was that they've generated, I believe, billions of dollars. So why would they ever consider stopping? And I've
Right.
talked about this before too. That Kim Kardashian had an app that last year was estimated to make her, just her, not the entire organization. I think it was estimated to make her around 70 to 80 million dollars last year alone. All it is a freemium app that again you can acquire for free, and then to be able to add on or make yourself or your character better, you pay a little bit of money, and through that was making her millions upon millions of dollars last year. So why would they ever stop? Uh, so how would we educate them as the more, because you and I would consider us more steadfast gamers, gamers in the know who play video games regularly, but also would not be remotely interested in something like this, the microtransactions for paying for a new skin on a character or things like that. Or even
Right.
paying for an extra quest that's probably underdeveloped. It's just something that they got out there so that they could charge a little bit of extra money. How do we, as more aware gamers and just more aware citizens, inform others to be able to prevent this from happening?
I mean, this is a cultural issue, right?
Yeah.
Whether, I mean, Kim Kardashian, I mean, you're talking about the bottom of the bucket in a lot of ways. Uh, can you educate people enough to not be interested in such, absolute foolish waste of money? And that almost sounds like an old man thing to say, because ultimately, I waste money, another person wastes money. You could say, what's the difference? But I would say in that particular case, we have a cultural issue. And I think one of the best ways you can educate with games, one of the nice things about the internet is that there is an internet community out there that recognizes and makes people aware of how absolutely ridiculous this is in its own cultural way. But ultimately, if we always are striving against, a foolish waste of money, then we're just going to be exhausted. I'm going to cite a great Indian philosopher, Krishnamurti. He has a great book called Think on These Things. It's wonderful, kind of older book. But he talks about how we have this tendency to want to change the world when if you just focus on your own community, not ignoring the world, but focus on changing your own community. And if everyone tries to do that a little bit, then the world will become a better place. And that is idealistic, obviously. But we're not going to change people's opinions of Kim Kardashian so that they don't spend little bits of money on those stupid games. But there are examples where we can, at least ourselves, not make those decisions, try to form communities, especially online, where we are actively against them, make the really hard decision of saying we're not going to purchase those things, even if we like them. So there might be a freemium game that you do like. I've played Warframe, so yeah, Warframe through
Hmm.
Steam, but I've never purchased anything through it. Now you could say, well, but you're using their servers, don't you owe them something? Well, if they were to close down their server, I would stop playing. They depend on freemium. Uh, it's not a kind of a requirement of my playing that I pay anything, right?
Sure.
But I would think that it would be wrong for me to pay into that system because I'm sustaining something that's wrong. Maybe I shouldn't even play the game in the first place. I don't know. That might be a good question. But ultimately, it's just a cultural war. I don't know what to do except to just act differently myself and encourage others to not do it. Again, teaching people, making people aware. I think the fact that we call people whales should turn some people off from it. You know, I don't know.
You would think that it would, but well, let me posit this question in another way then. So you've talked about how Kim Kardashian, quote, bottom of the barrel, right? And how it would be very difficult for us to change the mind of somebody who is obsessed with, on whatever level, with a Kim Kardashian or some other celebrity of that type, right? And that may be true. If it is true that there's no way for us to change that person's perspective on it, does that mean that that person is invincibly ignorant? And I'm using this philosophy slash theology term, especially a moral theology of
Yeah.
invincible versus
Invincible
invincible
ignorance.
ignorance.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Invincible ignorance is some ignorance that can be changed. Invincible ignorance is something that fundamentally you could not expect to change.
Hmm.
This points to things like someone being brought up in an entirely and explicitly racist household in the South, for example, to use an
Hmm.
obvious example. Somebody who was raised in that household probably has invincible ignorance. And while it would be terrible for that person to be explicitly racist uh, outside of the home, it is difficult, if not impossible, to point the finger to that person and say, it is reasonably expected that you should know better than this because they were raised in such a way where that's basically impossible, if not totally impossible, save for perhaps an act of God, basically.
Hmm.
And so, in the same way, could it be a level of ignorance that leads them to be this whale, as we've referenced, is that invincible ignorance? In which case, if it is invincible ignorance, is there no moral culpability on the organization who preys on this invincible ignorance if they know that it exists and they know that it's a way for them to be able to make money and take money away from somebody who is freely giving it?
Hmm.
But can it even be freely given if it is invincible ignorance because they don't actually have control?
Yeah, okay. So there are a lot of things you could say here. I think it's invincible ignorance as a larger culture, not as individuals. And that's why, so I brought up Christian Birdie, because
Sure.
you can change individuals within your own group, but to try to change someone you've never seen, or let alone an entire culture, like a worldwide culture,
Hmm.
would be absolutely foolish. Right? I cannot change the opinions of 200 million people, or at least according to Krishnamurti. I'm not Gandhi. And although there are people who might become Gandhi, I highly doubt Gandhi started out saying, I will change the entire world. That's sort of an American fantasy or US American fantasy that, kind of like Rocky, I'm going to go out there and change the entire world. That is itself kind of foolish. So I would say invincible ignorance in terms of the larger culture, but individuals, no. But even presuming that, because you still have the issue of corporations feeding off of that invincible ignorance of the culture, right? So follow me so far, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So you still have that issue. I don't think there's moral culpability there because in that particular instance, I don't think we've established that there's something inherently immoral about microtransactions, or at least I've not heard a convincing argument. I've heard that it depreciates the value or it somehow harms the value of games, that they're not developed to the full potential. that somehow it makes gamers feel ripped off. It certainly makes me feel ripped off.
Sure.
I have to pay more than I would like, but that does not necessarily mean that it's immoral. And so, to assign, guilt to corporations, that would be very hard to jump to make. I'd have to hear an argument.
Yeah, and I don't think there ever will be necessarily a convincing argument for why all microtransactions are necessarily immoral. But there are ways that they're used, the ways that users are manipulated to try to be coaxed, and some of that is
Sure.
just advertising, right? That of course they're going to advertise for themselves. But most recently, the way that I've heard something critical of this was with Mortal Kombat X, which was just released.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
And if you don't know what that is, I mean, you've been asleep for the last 30 years.
I mean,
But
really.
Mortal Kombat X was a game that just came out, and on the main page, in the center of I think the three main icons that you can click on to proceed, is something that's pitching you some downloadable content, something you can pay a little bit extra for to be able to use.
Hmm.
And they also have the crypt, which seems like an interesting idea, is that you keep playing the game and you unlock different things throughout this crypt. You use whatever coins you develop through battle to be able to unlock different things. Or you could just pay $20 and the whole thing will be unlocked. So you could either spend, in the way that the IGN discussion proceeded, discuss it, it would take about 30 to 40 hours of actual gameplay to be able to unlock that. You could do that, or just pay the $20 and have everything unlocked.
Hmm.
And so that may be, I mean, that might be its own ethical question, the crypt. But pitching people so adamantly on the main page and almost mixing it in so that you might accidentally click on it
Hmm.
on the main screen, that seems like it could very obviously be a candidate for something. It's an immoral action of a microtransaction.
No, no, no. I disagree totally. I can see how that's culturally offensive. It's
Sure.
because our gaming culture, we would say, no, that cheapens the point of the game. Now, but in some sense, you could make the argument just as easily that that makes the game more entertaining. That you actually have to work for something in order to get it. Because otherwise, if you weren't paying that $20, they would not have the system in the first place where you would unlock it through coins and all that. Anyways, they
So
might not at
just so we're
least. Right?
clear,
Yeah.
of the two that I was referencing as possibly immoral, it was not the crypt that I was referencing as
Oh, okay.
the main, having it snuck in the main page, so it's in between the three things that you might click on. I think that has the potential to be
Oh,
immoral.
yeah, yeah, where you manipulate clicking and things. Yeah, no, no, certainly that would definitely be, and especially when you look at kids. Although kids shouldn't play Mortal Kombat because that would be immoral, I'm sure. Uh, if kids are getting on there and they might accidentally purchase something, I think a closer boundary would be when you rather than arenas that you can unlock, it's something like in an MMORPG like Neverwinter or something like that. If you can have people buy superpowers so that they're much stronger than everyone else, I think that's when it becomes problematic.
Sure.
Skins, if someone wants to waste money on skins, fine. They're
Right.
stupid. That's fine. But once it starts again diminishing the quality of the game, then that's where it becomes a problem. Especially if you've actually paid the upfront cost for the game itself. You are paying for equal footing. You
Hmm.
shouldn't have to pay extra to have equal footing. You have paid for equal footing by getting the game. So that's where I think you can get onto moral ground, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Absolutely. And I think that's the difference that we have between a freemium game, as we've discussed, versus a
Mm-hmm.
game that you're actually paying for. You're buying a physical disc or what have you, and you have a certain amount you actually have more in the game than you're allowed to play from purchasing the disc. Now, in some
Right.
ways, it's just because it's convenient to have it already on the disc if they know that they were going to publish it. But also, if they knew that they were going to have it and make it available to you, and they're going to have it early enough to have it on the disc, that means that was a plan for months and months in advance, not just
Sure.
something that they sort of had time to do at the end and things like that. So that's why it's complicated. Yeah, I think the issue of the crypt and something like that, where you actually have some means of acquiring that without actually paying extra, I think that is perfectly acceptable. I think
I
that's
like it a lot. Yeah, it's a
right.
great way to do it. Yeah.
Right, and I think that's where, to use perhaps my favorite, not perhaps my favorite fighting game franchise, Street Fighter, in contrast, was what used to be something that you could unlock certain characters or skins and things like that just by playing the game and making certain accomplishments in the game. They immediately decided, no, we're going to add this downloadable content later, and you can buy it, but there is no other way for you to acquire this extra
Right.
content. And if you play against other players online, you'll be able to witness this content, but you will not be able to partake.
Yeah, see, and that ends up going against the custom, the very culture that built the franchise.
Right.
And so, again, that's at a minimum culturally offensive, since that's the culture that grew the game series. Yeah, I can see why that's really frustrating. Absolutely.
Certainly.
Yeah.
So we probably should wrap up shortly, but I do want to ask, because I believe you just watched it yesterday. What did you think of Avengers?
My primary, all right, so I'm a complainer.
Yeah, of
My
course.
primary complaint, and I think you know more about the lore than I do, although I know a good deal, is I think they made the same mistake that Marvel made with Fantastic Four, with a lot of series, is not having enough lore in there, or at least not. Well, they paced it so quickly that you couldn't get the richness of the lore, but instead they filled time up with kind of sappy sentimentality and melodrama that I felt was totally wasted time, you know? So, for example, I'll give an example from Fantastic Four. I think it's Doctor Doom. Doctor Doom has the ability to see into other realities, right? The way things have happened,
I
correct?
don't think that's necessarily the case, but
I thought it was. That's why he's Doctor Doom, isn't it? Like he had a moment where he saw into other realities, or maybe that's a different character. Well, no. I think so. And
Scarlet
so,
Witch does that in Avengers, but Doctor Doom is who he is because he's super intelligent and basically is like the evil Iron Man, who happens to
right,
do magic.
but he should be able to see all these realities in which the world is doomed, right? And it's only in the one where he is ruling over everything that humans survive. As I understand the lore, his primary motivation, yeah, sure, it's selfish. No one's motivations are singular one thing, right? Philosophically or psychologically, we can say that. Yeah, he probably wants power, but he also wants to save humanity. And yet, the Fantastic Four, whoever goes up against him, Spider-Man, doesn't matter who, they're always stopping him from essentially saving all the planet. Now, they don't know that he's the only one who will save, or maybe they do and they believe they can do something about it. Nonetheless, knowing that lore makes you more interested in the character. And I think some of the characters could have gone, we could have gotten more into, especially artificial intelligence, some of these characters, and they just didn't.
Yeah, I had to see I saw Avengers twice, 2 days consecutively. And the first day,
Of
because I had to
course.
see it with two different people. Also, I had an interesting day the first time that I saw it, which
Uh,
I'll talk about off here. But
sure.
the first time that I saw it, I watched the movie and I thought, well, that was interesting and it was fun, but I don't know that I liked it nearly as much as I thought I would. The second time that I
Yeah.
saw it, I think more of it made sense to me.
Mm,
I was more entertained, but I still left with the feeling that I understand that Ultron wants to destroy the world and do this whole evolution thing. I just have no idea where that really came from.
right.
He
Where's that motivation? Except he's somehow related to Stark.
only tangentially because
Yeah.
watching it the second time, the first time I watched it, I thought, well, they're gonna say it's because he has Stark in him, and they keep making reference to that. But
Yeah.
really, everything that he is, his AI is, came from the gem. That's the impression that I got watching it the second time. In fact, watching it the second time, I was more certain that it really just
Mm-hmm.
comes from the gem.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know why they point at Tony Stark other than Tony Stark was more immediately around him and trying to create a vehicle for Ultron to become something other than merely an AI.
Yeah. And that's why the lore, I think, could have been reemphasized, or emphasized in a way that could make more sense. They paced the movie too quickly. They didn't explain characters enough. I loved the voice acting, though. It was awesome.
Yeah, I thought
You
James
know,
Spader did an excellent job with the role. I
yeah.
just thought that the role could have been expanded on better. And the original cut of that movie is, I think, 3 or 3.5 hours long. So if and when that
Wow.
becomes released, that may in fact elaborate on why Ultron is the way that he is and things like that. But I don't know. There was also the Thor scene with the water, uh, and I
With the
guess
water?
yeah, he goes into it's a spoiler alert, I guess, to some degree. He has this vision, right? Because every time Scarlet Witch touches somebody, they have a vision, and
Mm-hmm.
ultimately he has a vision of Ragnarok, and that's what's going to be the next Thor movie anyway. But he catches something that he didn't catch.
Oh, right.
So in order to catch that thing again, he has to go into the scene where he goes into the mountains and dips himself in the water and ingratiates himself with some spirits there or something like that. But they don't flesh that scene out. And Joss
The real
Whedon,
mistake. They should. That's the rich kind of scene instead of just having characters talking about family home life. They were trying to be two different types of movies, and I don't think they could decide. Do we want to be an action movie, or do we want to be a movie which has sort of like a Robert Redford approach to the human condition or something? It just seemed like an absurd, sort of forced narrative about, well, who was it? Not Hawkeye. Yeah,
who was Hawkeye? Yeah,
yeah, it was
Ryan Reynolds'
Hawkeye.
character.
It's just unnecessary narrative that I didn't see the point of, except to artificially create an exit for characters.
I think that's possible. I don't think that's what they were trying to do. I think that's ultimately what happened. I think what they were trying to do is focus on Hawkeye because everybody coming out of the first movie was like, why is Hawkeye even in this movie? He
Yeah,
seems totally irrelevant. And so the
yeah,
second movie directly addresses why he bothers to be on this team. Like even Hawkeye is very self-aware and says, this city is flying. I have a bow and arrow. I don't know what's going on. Something
right.
very close to that.
It was very funny. Yeah,
Right, and it was totally appropriate for him to have that scene. I just think, and Joss Whedon, the director and writer, talked about this, was that he had a real struggle with the studio trying to argue for the validity of scenes like expanding on this Thor scene to explain what was going on and why this was relevant at all. Because as a viewer who watched it twice, still not really sure why he had to go do that, other than I have the context of what Joss Whedon has said in interviews afterward. And to
right,
be fair to the studios, they have a very particular mindset of how they want to do it. And Kevin Feige, the producer, executive producer, has a very particular lens that he looks through these for these movies, and he's confident in himself because on the whole they have been a raging commercial success. So you can always point to, look, I got the money. You're going to do this my way.
right. Well,
And
Kim Kardashian says the same thing, but it doesn't mean it's quality.
it doesn't mean it's quality. Although, in Kevin Feige's defense, he did a movie like Guardians of the Galaxy, which no one had any reasonable expectation that that was going to be a good movie, and that was
Right.
actually a pretty excellent movie.
Yeah. There were some miscasts in that, though. Maybe we'll save that argument for another time.
Maybe we will. Uh, but I mean, the reason why I bring it up in a larger frame is, of course, because of the struggle between a writer and producers. It's someone who wants to create art and someone who has to pay for that art, and who is in the right there? Who should be given more power? Obviously, ultimately, it's going to be the person who's going to provide the money to create this art.
Sure.
But uh, you know,
Sometimes you just want a giant metal spider in your movie,
that's right.
and so you find a way to force it in.
I'm glad we
Absolutely.
were able to reference Wild Wild West.
There you
Will
go.
Smith,
There you
you
go.
have been referenced. All
Yeah.
right, on that happy note, I don't think you have a Twitter or anything that you would want people to hit you up on, right?
I have them, several of them, but no.
But no. All right. Well, thank you all for listening. Feel free to hit me up on @amoralaction on Twitter, or you can email me at amoralaction@gmail.com. And remember, every action is a moral action. Thanks again.